Hello, everybody. My name is Bobby Joe, and I use she, her pronouns. I am the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Officer for the Maine National Guard. We'll talk about the various roles that we have in this program as we go through this training. But what I'd like you to just kind of take from this in the beginning here is that this is actually a new position based on some recommendations from the Independent Review Commission, which we'll talk about a little bit in the future slides. Previous to this role, there was an Army National Guard sexual assault response coordinator, and then an Air National Guard sexual assault response coordinator. And I filled that Air National Guard position for the last 4 years. Actually, February will be 4 years. With these changes that came about with these recommendations, they created this role, and this new role as the SAPR officer is going to be a joint position where we will work the program in a joint environment. So we'll cover down on both sides, and hopefully that'll make sense to you as we progress. You know, when I built this training originally, and of course I've tweaked it as there have been changes, I built it based on the Air Force structure. I've tweaked it to add some of the changes, and what I'm going to share with you is that the Air Force SAPR vision is to establish a national benchmark for recovery and eliminate sexual assault through empowered and engaged airmen. If we go to the Army, if we go to the Navy, the Marine Corps, even the Coast Guard, you're going to find a similar mission statement, a similar benchmark, because that's really what we're trying to do: eliminate sexual assault to the greatest of our ability and provide a response and support program that will help our DoD members, civilians and military uniform wearers, get the help and support that they need to be able to heal, to be able to go forward on that journey, and to have long and productive military careers if that's what they choose to do, but have it be their choice and not because they experienced something. So as I was updating these slides a couple of days ago, it occurred to me that we currently have a vacant wing position. And yesterday, so today is the 30th of November, 2022, yesterday that position just posted. So I know that this training will be used out throughout the year, but just so that you know that we do have more positions that will be posted in the future. This is all part of the recommendations. Let's see. Ultimately, what I want to kind of acknowledge before we move on is that, you know, I could talk about this program all day with you folks and probably still have lots to talk about. There's a lot to this program. There's a lot of nuances. And even within the different branches, there are some nuances, right? Like Navy, some of the laws and rules they have to follow differ when they're out to sea, right? Because they've crossed certain boundaries or certain geographical lines and so forth. And so I really could talk about this all day. My hope is that by the end of this training, I will have given you at least a basic understanding of what is available for our folks and what we do to support, and then maybe even talk a little bit about how you can help us in terms of support and those sorts of things. What we're going to talk about today, sexual assault in the military, we're going to talk just some basic numbers and timelines, the effects of military sexual trauma. I left Mary Rose Collane's name on here. We use this, she presented that portion of the training when we presented to the Governor's Advisory Council. She is the wonderful, amazing human being who runs the military sexual trauma program at the VA at Togus. So I left that there because I wanted that as a reminder that, you know, we do this with a whole team of folks. And Mary Rose can certainly give a much more in-depth training. And that might be something that we look at in the future, is to bring her in for a separate training specific to military sexual trauma. I think that would be very important. We're going to talk about the SARC and the volunteer victim advocate positions, and now some newly created full-time victim advocate positions, eligibility, reporting options, some benefits and limitations of those, and then some DoD specific services provided. So taking it out of our immediate community and looking into what the DoD has established for support. And then how what we're providing for education to our currently serving members, and that is military as well as civil service folks that we're providing that support to. So when we're talking about sexual assault in the military, numbers and timelines, I want to just take a quick moment to remind you that unless somebody has been convicted of a crime, of a sexually based crime, we're not going to have a way to know that as people come into the service. We are a pie slice of society, whether we're talking about the Maine National Guard or we're talking about Maine members who join the active duty service and they go off, to other places. The United States military is about a 1% pie slice of society. And so there really is no way of knowing when somebody comes in if they have the propensity to do bad things, unless they've already been convicted. And if they've already been convicted, they're not coming in. And so it's really important for us to talk about the prevention piece of things, and keep in mind when we're looking at numbers and so forth that we really are a pie slice of society. So does it happen in the military? Yes, it absolutely does. But similarly in the larger community. And I think one of the benefits that we have in the military or in the DoD setting is that we have a captive audience. And so we can pull numbers that might look a little different than what we see on the community side. It's not as easy to send out a survey to the entire state of Maine and say, hey, citizens of Maine, could you please participate in this? Can it happen? Sure, it absolutely can happen. But the participation and the influence to participate in those surveys, it can look a little bit different. So I just want you to think about that as we're going through these next couple of slides. We're going to talk about some timelines, both for the SAPR program, but also for some high profile sexual assault scandals. I hate that they're called scandals. That's just my little peeve. Sexual assault is a crime. We all know that. I don't see sexual assault as a scandal, but I guess when you look in the bigger picture and you've got these things happening in an institution, whether that's the larger branch or, one particular command within that branch, I guess that's why they call it a scandal. I just don't like calling it a scandal. It's a crime. It's a crime committed against people. So we're going to review some of these numbers and timelines. So on this slide, I really didn't want to get into the weeds. This information you can pull from the annual report. Since the start of the SAPR program, there has been the requirement for the Department of Defense SAPR office to provide a report to the president every year. So the backdrop to this slide is the FY19 numbers. But I just wanted it there for you to see that it happens. It happens in the military. It's tracked if somebody chooses to come forward and track it. And we have a couple of other options that we'll talk about later that can even help even beyond somebody actually choosing to officially report it. Sorry, I apologize. I just want to double check my notes to make sure I don't forget anything before I go on to the next slide. So as we go on to the next slide, what I do want to show you is the FY21. So our FY is a fiscal year, right? So October 1 to 30 September of the following year. So this is what we were looking at for National Guard as a whole. This is not just Maine. This is the National Guard as a whole across the whole country, across the 54 actually, right? Because we've got the 50 states, Washington, D.C., and then 3 territories. We will talk about Title 32 and Title 10 a little. Actually, let's touch on that right now. So when we're talking Title 32 versus Title 10, Title 32 is the state statute or the state, not statute, status that and the most National Guard members are in for the majority of their career. If you look at Title 10, that's when our members actually activate and deploy. It could be a local deployment, it could be an overseas deployment, but that Title 10, in order for them to go into a deployed status, they have to be on a Title 10 status. This is all administrative stuff that happens, but the benefits are dictated by what status the member is in when the assault happens. The punishment is dictated by that. So if the reported offender is a military member, the status that he or she is in at the time is going to dictate how that punishment looks, right? So under a Title 32, status, a state status, if you will, that would be all local law enforcement. There would be no UCMJ attached to that. Whereas Title 10, the UCMJ is specific to the Title 10. So it's also important to recognize that, because we could have a military reported offender who is in a Title 32 status and maybe gets a much lesser punishment when all is said and done than his or her counterpart who is in Title 10 status when they commit the offense, and then they're subject to the UCMJ. And so they could possibly have a much stricter punishment, and that's really important to note as well. What I've shown here is the first number. I was just going to point to my screen like you could see that. The first number, the 168, if we're looking at total reports, that is this year's numbers for the Air National Guard. 536 is this past FY for the Army National Guard, and 704 is a total. We had an 11.04% increase in numbers. And as you look down, you can see the increase in the various areas. I think that there are a lot of things that played a part in this increase. And I'm going to take this moment to share with you one of the reasons that I dislike just generally putting numbers out here, but I also think it's important. So when we're looking at this number, 704, that does not mean that 704 military members or National Guard members assaulted somebody. This means that 704 people in the National Guard who were eligible to reported an assault. The offender could have been a foreign national if they were deployed. It could have been a civilian if they were deployed and or if they were here. That number does not show the number of military offenders. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that separation. And we have a slide in a few that will kind of acknowledge that. So just some numbers here for you to be able to look at. All right, so let's talk some timelines here. We're looking at military sexual assault timelines. So if any of you have ever worked with military veterans or current military, especially if you've worked with older veterans, Vietnam, Korean War, World War II, we're losing most of those, unfortunately, because time marches on, right? Take a minute. Anyway, so what you will most likely know is that military sexual assault did not start in 1991. This is just the timeline where the scandals became more public, or the start of the timeline where they became more public, and where I chose to start the timeline, because the reality is we could take this far back, but we'll start with 1991. So we have the Navy tailhook scandal. That was the Navy and the Marine Corps. It was an aviation conference that was held in Las Vegas at the Las Vegas Hilton. And by the end of it, 83 men and women had been sexually assaulted. It just isn't, it's an ugly story. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it was a big deal. I mean, 83 victims out of one event. Sick, gross, horrible, just everything that you can imagine. We jump up to 1996. We have the U.S. Army Aberdeen scandal. So Aberdeen, Maryland was a basic training location for the Army. It was an infantry training at the time. It was all men, unless they were female trainees there for support careers. MOS, Army calls it MOS, Navy calls it rate, Air Force calls it AFSC, but unless they were support services, it was predominantly men. But In Aberdeen in 1996, drill sergeants and other instructors were regularly using their powers to get sexual favors from young female trainees. I think that there were males as well, but it was, you know, as we see with lots of things, we talk about this being a women's right. Women are victims, but that's not the case. Oftentimes it's opportunistic, and if men is what you have opportunity to have access to, then, you know, that's unfortunately who your victims are going to be. So this was at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, as I said, in Maryland. 12 drill instructors were charged with sex crimes. 4 were sentenced to prison, while 8 were discharged or received non-judicial punishment. So there's the general, he was the commanding general at the time. His name is Major General Robert Shatley. He's, of course, long since retired, but he wrote a book called The Game. And I would encourage you to go read that, if for nothing else, just for some backstory to that, and to have an understanding and kind of see it from a commanding general's perspective when this happened. Then we jump to a 3-year period, 2009 to 2012, at the Air Force basic training. So that would have been in Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And I apologize. It's the first one was 2003. The second one was 2009 through 2012. But it involved allegations of sexual assault in the Air Force Academy, as well as allegations at the basic training. So the 2003 was the Air Force Academy. I have served with many women and currently work with women who were there during that time frame. And to hear their stories is just sickening. And then, so I need to jump back because I did misspeak on this. So 2003 was the Air Force Academy. 2009 through 2012 was Air Force basic training. That happened in Lackland. The Air Force Academy, jumping back, that's in Colorado. The Air Force basic training scandal in San Antonio was 43 female trainees who had allegedly been assaulted by their instructors. 17 male instructors were accused of offenses ranging from solicitation of improper relationships to rape. And 35 instructors were removed from their posts pending investigation. 9 of those instructors belonged to the 331st Training Squadron, and Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Mike Paquette was removed from command in June of 2012 because of the problems in that unit. Glenn Palmer, commander of the 737th Training Group, was also relieved of his position due to the scandal. So these are high-ranking folks, and on a training base like that, they are kind of like the bomb, right? And these folks were not, they were held accountable for what was happening within the unit. Fast forward to 2013, the chief of the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, he was the chief of this program for the Air Force. He was 42 at the time, and he was arrested after an encounter in a parking lot outside of a bar in Crystal City, which is down there in the National Capital Region. He was sentenced to, oh no, I'm jumping ahead here. This really started bigger and harder conversations about whether the military was even equipped to handle these types of crimes. It still was a long time before anything was done, but it was also the start of some big changes in the SAPR program, which we'll talk about in a bit. 2015, the U.S. Army Sexual Assault Response Coordinator was arrested and pled guilty for running a prostitution and trafficking ring. So this is a man who was doing the job that I do now. He was the head of this program for that base. I think if I remember correctly, it was Fort Hood. Let's see. Ultimately, he did plead guilty to 15 counts. The soldiers who were coming to him to report sexual assaults, he was trafficking them out, prostituting them out. So imagine how horrible that is, that you go to the person that you're supposed to trust. I mean, it's horrible enough that you've experienced the assault, but then you go to the person who's supposed to support you and they end up abusing you as well. It was horrible. And yeah, he was sentenced to 24 months in confinement. and busted down to E1. So he was, his name was McQueen, Sergeant First Class, I think, or Master Sergeant First Class. So that's an E7. So he was busted down from E7 to E1 and dishonorably discharged. He did 24 months in jail. Just as a side note, unless things have changed in the last year or two, that would not have been Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth, you only go to if you are convicted and sentenced to 11 years or more. So he would have served his time in another prison. It might have been a military brig, or it might have been a local to where he was prison. After he was released, actually, he became a caretaker at a foster home, and proper documentation through the law enforcement systems had not happened. So his military arrest was not in the system, and that's how he was able to get that job. So if you can think back to that time frame, that's when there were a lot of huge conversations about the fact that he was able to get a job doing direct care work that he should never been allowed to have been part of. And so that changed some things in the military as far as law enforcement and their reporting requirements and so forth. And then we go to 2020. 6 active duty soldiers were arrested for sex trafficking. We had in Bahrain, we had the Tinder sailor, hooker, pimp. That was a sex trafficking scandal event in Bahrain. And I mean, you can see from looking at this timeline, none of the branches are immune from this. I remember back in the day, there was a ship, the USS O'Kane, was actually built here in Maine at the shipyard, and it was home ported in Hawaii. And that's when I still lived in Hawaii. My homage to my 20 years in Hawaii in the background here. The O'Kane had its maiden voyage, and it was a 6-month deployment to bring it from Bath, Maine, all the way down and around and into Honolulu. By the time they got to Honolulu, there was a female E7 on that ship who was running a prostitution ring. And they found, oh gosh, I don't remember the exact amount, but I mean, they found tens of thousands of dollars of cash in her footlocker, but she was prostituting her junior sailors out to the other sailors on the ship. Just disgusting. So it marches on, right? And then if you remember what happened a few years ago with Vanessa Guillen, and then multiple National Guard units in states being under the microscope for the way they were and were not handling sexual assault and reporting and those sorts of things. So time frames, let's look at the SAPR program time frames, because this is going to tie in some of those other things that we just talked about, the scandal timelines. So 2004, in February of that year, the Care for Victims of Sexual Assault Task Force was created. And that was like a 90-day task force, similar to this 90-day independent review commission we just had. In October of that year, the Joint Task Force for Sexual Assault Prevention and Response was created. And in this time frame, they were looking at all of the branches, how this was being handled, what commanders were doing. At that time, commanders had the ability to investigate sexual assault, which was changed over time. That was taken from commanders. And it never did make sense to me, because to me, that was a crime. I mean, it is a crime, right? And commanders don't necessarily investigate burglary or murder or those sorts of things, but how in an active duty command things work, it is a little different, because active duty Title 10, they do have the UCMJ, and things look a little different. So they looked at all of those things, and on 1 January of 2005, this program, the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program, became effective. Officially, there were sexual assault response coordinators and victim advocates. They became part of this picture. Often is the case when we have issues in the military, in the Department of Defense, we say, hey, we've got an issue. It's been brought to light. Here's some money, go fix it. And that's not to say that it's callous. It's to say that we've got the resources, but sometimes, and I think this is in real life too, we put the cart before the horse. And we do the best we can with what we've got. And that's what we did back in 2005. We had this program. We said, hey, who wants to be a victim advocate? Who wants to be a SARC? And so people step up, and we go through the training that we go through, and this is what we do. Round about the 2012 timeframe, things really changed because there were a lot of things that were happening. Some of these scandals, as you saw, were happening. And so some big changes came to the SAPR program. One of those, and that's really the SAPR program as we know it today, that's really when that started. Even though the program started in 2005, and I actually have been part of this program in one form or another since 2008. But 2012 is really when it began to take form, take shape. That is when they started requiring us to be credentialed as SARCs and victim advocates. So we are credentialed through the through NOVA. There's a program called DSAC-P through NOVA, which is the Department of Defense Sexual Assault Advocate Credentialing Program. So anyway, that's when this started happening. And then also the National Guard was finally allowed to do a restricted report. And we'll talk about the reporting options a few slides down. But this is really when it changed. So 2013, that's when the first credentialed SAPR professionals were put into place, right? So we had to go through some additional training and then be put in for extended background screenings and then be put in for our credentialing once we passed those background screenings. Now, when this happened, as you can imagine, there was lots of house cleaning that happened because of the extended background screening. We were finding people in these positions who basically did it either for the power of the position or because it was a bullet on their evaluation. But we were finding folks who had been accused and substantiated sexual harassment. We're finding folks who had domestic violence in their history, child abuse. I mean, there were just all kinds of things. So did a big, huge house cleaning. Now, that's not to say that there weren't still people in those positions, because remember, McQueen down at Fort Hood was 2015 timeframe. But the thing was, had he ever been reported? Had it ever been part of the record? And so until somebody is reported and or it's part of the record, that's not going to show up in an extended screening, right? So that, the evolution was happening. In 2015 is when the Air National Guard, actually the National Guard as a whole, started putting in full-time sexual assault response coordinators. Prior to that, it was an additional duty to the executive officer, to the wing commander. And even at the Army side of the house, it was not a full-blown, here, this is how we're going to do a position. So 2015 is when we really started getting those full-timers. 2019, August of that year, the Catch a Serial Offender program began, and we've had a recent change to that. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And then most recently, as a result of Vanessa Guillen's murder and the conversation that was prompted from her being missing and then murdered and the other things that came out as a result of that, President Biden ordered a 90-day independent review commission. That review commission made 82 recommendations to the Secretary of Defense, and Secretary Austin said, we are going to do all 82. So some of those changes we've been able to implement immediately, others not so immediate, but they are taking place. And when I say not so immediate, it's not because we don't want to do it, it's because they require a resource. So for example, the state of Maine is going to get an additional sexual assault response coordinator full-time at the brigade level. We're not sure where that's going to be located yet, but we will be getting that extra full-time position. But that requires a resource. And so Congress has to, or Department of Defense has to budget for that. Congress has to approve that. And then we have to get the money and then roll out that process. So those are the kinds of things, the ones that require resources and those sorts of things. They're going to take a little bit longer, but some of the more immediate ones we'll talk about today. And some of them are so fantastic that, like, just fantastic. The Catch program, you're going to love, and the change that they made to it. So typically, as I said earlier, we have Mary Rose talk about this piece of things, but I'm just going to touch on it a little bit differently. Military sexual trauma is a phrase that the VA uses. And they use that term to be inclusive of sexual harassment as well as sexual assault. The trauma from sexual harassment can be just as damaging as trauma from sexual assault. When you're in this environment where it's repetitive and you're going into work every day not knowing what's going to come next and those sorts of things. And so it has a definition. As defined by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, military sexual trauma are experiences of sexual assault or repeated threatening sexual harassment that occurred while a person was in the United States Armed Forces. Most people with trauma-related problems have experienced multiple traumas, and you, having worked with many of those folks, you know this is part of this work, right? The term complex trauma describes exposure to multiple traumas. It also refers to the impacts of that exposure. So complex trauma, of course, encompasses sexual assault, hazing, bullying, sexual harassment. It nearly always includes some form of interpersonal or institutional betrayal. So it occurs between two people within an organization or within the organization, right? So the betrayal of maybe a victim coming forward and the organization not supporting them. And that could be, it involves feeling trapped, being or feeling trapped, right? It's often planned, extreme, ongoing, repeated. So sexual harassment for sure, sexual assault as well. But sexual harassment, I think that people just don't, I think some people just want to do bad stuff. But I also believe that there are those that just don't understand the damage of the harassment that they're putting forward, right? That old toughen up, get thick skin kind of concept. Often it has more severe, persistent, and cumulative impacts. It involves challenges with shame, trust, self-esteem, identity, and regulating emotions. It has different coping strategies, and oftentimes these can include alcohol and drug use, self-harm, over and under eating, overworking, underworking, all these sorts of things. These become effects of the trauma that are going to affect the soldier or airman's career. And I say soldier and airman because in the National Guard, we only have Army and Air, but recognize sailor, Marine, Coastie. Coasties are sailors, but we like to refer to them as their coasties to differentiate Navy and Coast Guard. With military sexual trauma, often the conversation is that it can equates to incest, right? You're in this family, you're in this brotherhood, this sisterhood of folks who are supposed to be our protectors. You've got my six, you've got my right side, whatever. But then this violation happens, right? Sometimes from a trusted teammate. And then you're required to work together. And it really breaks that bond, not just between the victim and the offender, if and when we have military offenders, but it even breaks the bond within the unit, because as offenders do, they will often, go and spread rumors and talk and really make the victim look like the bad person. And so that can cause units to split apart and people take sides, and it really erodes the cohesion of a unit. And that cohesion is necessary for our folks to do the jobs that they're trained to do, that they do for our military to protect our freedoms and so forth. Another thing that can be a challenge as a result of military sexual trauma is an expedited victim transfer. So if anybody experiences a sexual assault and they have the opportunity to request an expedited victim transfer, this is at their request, and it's transferring them to either another unit within the state for the National Guard, or it might even be that they just transfer to another state. And the problem with this, with National Guard, or not problem, a challenge with this is that in the active duty world, while the challenge of moving is a challenge, it's easier for the active duty force to find that military member a new position elsewhere, or doing the same job they already do, right? In the National Guard, we're more limited. And so in the National Guard, when a victim requests an expedited transfer, it could mean that they have to retrain. So in essence, they're starting the professional part of their career over again, right? Because they're starting at the bottom with this new skill set. And it's only authorized for unrestricted reports. It requires command approval. And, you'll see when we talk about the reporting options, command is only involved with an unrestricted report. If it's a restricted report, it means command doesn't know what happened. And that's at the request of the victim. And of course, military sexual trauma often results in complex trauma, which we talked about a few minutes ago. One of the other problems that we see in the military, or one of the other challenges, is that with male victims, they tend to, so 1 out of 5 male victims that participated in surveys that the DoD has held. 1 in 5 male victims who came forward and reported their assault said that they didn't initially recognize their assault as a sexual assault. They saw it as hazing, or, you know, that old-fashioned military mentality, hyper masculinity. There's no room for weakness. Or maybe it was just locker room behavior type stuff, right? So they know that something happened and they're not okay with it. They're not processing through life well. They're not doing well with coping mechanisms, right? But they just didn't necessarily associate that as a sexual assault. And so we do find that often with male victims when we have conversations with them, whether they do an official report or not. Oftentimes that's what we're hearing from them, is that they just thought that was hazing. That was just part of being, you know, in this unit. You know, if you want to be special forces, or you want to be a cop, or you want to be a pilot, or you know, whatever it is. I'm just throwing out some different things there. It's not specific to where those assaults are happening. But oftentimes they would just see that as the price you pay for being there, right? And that's not the case. That is not the case. It's illegal. It's unacceptable. It's dangerous. It's just bad. Some other things that we find working with male victims, which I think is probably similar on the community side of the house, the civilian side of the house, is that feeling that if they are a straight man, that people are going to think that they're gay, and or if that happens, how will they be treated? And there are perceived threats to their career, possibly their security clearance, possibly retaliation. There are protections in place to protect victims and bystanders and support folks from retaliation. But I liken that to a protective order, right? If we get a protective order, that's a piece of paper that says, don't go near that person, right? And that's what those protections from retaliation are. They are rules and regulations that say, don't go near that person. But that person already violated rules and regulations and law when they committed the assault or committed the harassment, right? And so it's an added layer. And to say that there are protections from retaliation, yes, there are, but that doesn't mean they won't be retaliated against. I hope that makes sense. Because the reality is, if somebody wants to retaliate, they're going to retaliate, but there are added layers for how that person will be protected if and when that happens, and what those punishments would look like for the reported offender. And in this case, I use reported offender not just as the person who maybe committed the assault, but maybe their buddy that they've been talking to, saying, hey, yeah, this person here, they're going to come forward and they're going to say XYZ happened, but, you saw them at the party last week, or you saw them at the bar drinking, and, he or she was hammered, and what did they, they will just, it's offender behavior. And I don't think we need to get into that. So the retaliation can happen at the hands of somebody else, not just the reported offender who committed the assault, but friends or coworkers or so forth that maybe think that that person is getting the raw end of the stick. Bear with me for a moment because my computer doesn't, here we go. And I hope that you are writing down questions as we're going through this. I know that this is a recorded training, but I welcome any and all questions, and would absolutely look forward to maybe a live Q&A where we can cover down on some of the questions that you had as a result of this. Okay, so let's talk about the SARC, Sexual Assault Response Coordinator. We have acronyms for everything. And the victim advocates we refer to as VAs, credentialing and their responsibilities. But before we get into that, what I do want to talk about is the separation of support and advocacy, which is our program, the SAPR program, and command actions. So our program, the SAPR program, is for any eligible member who has experienced a sexual assault at any point in their life. So let's say somebody joins the military later in life, and they were assaulted in college when they were attending college, and something happens that kind of triggers, they get some trauma echo happening as a result of maybe something that was talked about in a training, or just somebody's fragrance walking by, right? Anything can be a trauma reminder. They are eligible to come file a report and get support and advocacy. So it's not just for people who were assaulted while they were in the military by a military member. It is for any of our eligible members who want support and advocacy, and they get to determine what that looks like, how little or how great, based on what we are able to do. Command action, that is the administrative stuff, the punishment stuff, if the reported offender is a military member. In the SAPR program, we don't get to dictate to commanders what they should do. We can advise, we can talk to them about what trauma looks like and organizational trauma and victimology and all those sorts of things. We absolutely can talk to them about that to inform their decisions. But ultimately, they are the commander and they have to make those decisions, and we can't tell them what to do. So when it comes down to, we have a reported offender who's a military member and there's going to be a military process, the only role or the only part that myself and my teammates play in that action or those actions is supporting that victim through that process. The command is responsible for the punishment and any of the administrative stuff like an expedited transfer and those sorts of things. And I think it's really important to remember that, because oftentimes we mix the responsibilities of this program and we include it with the responsibilities of commanders. And it's important to delineate that. And I think I'm rambling a little bit, so I'm just going to let that be right there for now. So eligibility, reporting options, benefits, and limitations. Let me just move some of this screen stuff around. So let's talk about eligibility. So in this program, active duty members who were sexual assault victims perpetrated by somebody other than the victim's spouse, same-sex domestic partner, and or unmarried intimate partner. Also eligible active duty members, dependents 18 and older, who are eligible for treatment in the military health system, as long as the assault was perpetrated by somebody other than the victim's spouse, same-sex domestic partner, and or unmarried intimate partner. Members of the Air Force and Army Reserve and Air Force and Army National Guard who are in a Title 10 status and are assaulted while performing active duty or in active duty training receive full support services. So whether they're activated on Title 10 or they're in their home station 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year status, they are entitled to receive support status or support services. The benefits they receive in terms of medical and those sorts of things, those are all going to be determined by status as well. Air Force civilian employees, both appropriated and non-appropriated, who were sexual assault victims, again, perpetrated by somebody other than the spouse or intimate partner, same sex or otherwise. Recently, the Army National Guard has also added their civilian employees to this as well. And so, so even our civilian employees like myself, if you knew Ms. Zabrick for the past year, she was the JFHQ SARC. She was a civilian. We have many civilian employees these days. And so those folks are all eligible to file a report as well. And their benefits are just going to look different. Status matters. I have that up there because we've already talked about Title 10 and Title 32. But it's important to know that a Guard member at any given point can be in one of 22 different statuses. And each of those statuses is going to determine what their benefits are. And even what the punishment for the reported offender is if they are in some sort of a status, right? You know, if it's Monday through Friday, full-time technician time, that falls under labor laws. I know that sounds crazy, but the National Guard really is kind of a big employer, given we are a Title 32 status, right? When they go Title 10, they attach to another command, they go off and they do their things. So status really does matter. Even having worn the uniform for 22 years, I'm a 22-year Air National Guard veteran with about 7 years of active duty under my belt. Even having worn that uniform and been part of the National Guard for 22 years and now working for the National Guard as a civilian, I don't even know all 22 of those statuses. So I think it's important that if you folks are working with a member of the National Guard, reach out to me or one of the other members of my team, and let's have that conversation about what's available to that person. And even if you just want to clarify what something means, right? We often will talk about our military stuff and forget that, the average civilian just doesn't understand that. And quite honestly, the average active duty member doesn't understand the Guard because it's different. There are a lot of things that are different. So even, I've met in the community before, I've met police officers and attorneys who were previously active duty, and they're like, well, you're the military, you can do XYZ. Well, no, we can't. We are the military, but we're the National Guard and we fall under a different status. So it's really, I'm going to say this probably a few more times throughout this training, status really, really matters. So when the reported offender is the partner in the context of a spousal relationship, same-sex, unmarried, intimate partner, or when it's a military dependent who's 17 years of age or younger, the active duty program, they have, or all the branches, they have what's called the Family Advocacy Program, and they manage those cases. Currently, the National Guard does not have a Family Advocacy Program. And one of the struggles that we have for our folks who are on active duty, Title 10, maybe doing a local Title 10 mission, is that our closest family advocacy program is down at Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts, down in the Arlington area. And so the intent, when the Department of Defense set this kind of rule that the SAPR program handles sexual assault as long as it's not in the context of an intimate partner relationship. It really had to do with training. We all know that the potential for lethality goes up with domestic violence cases versus acquaintance or stranger sexual assault. And so that's where the separation comes in. They have victim advocates as well, but they have a very differently trained team of folks who handle that. In the National Guard, what we end up doing is doing a warm handoff with our Director of Psychological Health, as well as work to connect them with our community partners. So in the Bangor area, Partners for Peace, or any one of those MCADV folks. Community support centers, maybe even some of the Mikaso support centers, just depending on what the situation is. And we work with them to get them connected with somebody who can support them appropriately, if that's their wish, right? So again, we may have that conversation with them about Partners for Peace, just using that one as an example, but they may never actually reach out to the advocates over there. So just really important, back to the status matters, really important to understand this. Now, when somebody does come forward and report, if they're eligible to report, they have a couple of different reporting options. So there are two reporting options that are considered official reports. These two, restricted and unrestricted, that you're seeing on the screen here, these reports, official reports, only happen if the victim survivor comes to the SAPR office, whether it's me or one of the other SAPR professionals that I work with on the team. They do an intake process with us, which is lengthy, and then they sign that form. And I will make sure that Kara has copies of that form so that you folks can look through it and see what exactly we talked to them about, and what they're agreeing to when they agree to do this formal report. So with a restricted report, we talked about the Independent Review Commission that just recently happened, and this is one of the changes that happened as a result of this. We have a group of folks within the DoD who are considered mandatory reporters. So anybody in the chain of command to include the commander, any of the E9, so sergeants major, chiefs, chief master sergeants in the Air Force side of the house, law enforcement, provost marshal, the EO office, the attorneys, unless they are the attorney for the victim, they are mandatory reporters. And so when this program first started, if an eligible victim told a mandatory reporter that they experienced a sexual assault, it was an automatic, their only option was to file an unrestricted report. So if they chose to not file a report at all because their only option was unrestricted, then we had what was called an open with limited case. So the commander or whoever the mandatory reporter is would be required to notify me as the SARC and then law enforcement, because it's a crime, right? One of the things that we saw happen over the years is that somebody would disclose to a mandatory reporter, not wanting an unrestricted report, not wanting bells and whistles to go off. But it just maybe that moment it was a safe space. Oftentimes it was the first sergeant, right? Because our first sergeants, they are morale and welfare of their formation. And so I use that as an example, but it happened with commanders as well, in other leaders who just trusted, like people trusted them. And that's great. It's great that they had somebody they trusted, but the way the program was set up was that if the mandatory reporter knew, then the only option was for the victim to have an unrestricted report. So what was happening is folks would disclose to a mandatory reporter, accidentally or otherwise, and then realize, oh gosh, my only option is for an unrestricted report. And they would kind of, throw their hands in the air and say, well, if I can only have an unrestricted report, I'm not going to do a report at all. And what that meant in the bigger picture was that they were not coming to the SAPR office and having a conversation with us about what it means to have a report, what support services are available, what advocacy looks like, and what it can look like for them at their choice, right? And so one of the changes that that were made as one of the recommendations was that if somebody discloses to a mandatory reporter, with the exception of law enforcement, so you'll see that in that first bullet on the purple side, if they disclose to a mandatory reporter with the exception of law enforcement, they can still come to the SAPR office and do a restricted report. That does not change the mandatory reporter's requirement to notify me and to notify law enforcement, but that mandatory reporter will not know that the victim survivor came to our office and said, I want some support, and then got support. And that's that whole restricted part. And that is put in place to give people that opportunity to get that support and get on better footing by their own definition, to go forward with the process or to just heal and move on, and whatever is their choice, right? So if we getting into these two reports, there is a very restricted group of people who can offer confidentiality. So that would be myself and my team, who are credentialed advocates, and we are held to that confidentiality. Medical professionals, behavioral health professionals, and our chaplain support services as well. The only folks who can actually do that report, that official report, is the SAPR professionals. So all those other folks that I listed, they have confidentiality and they are not mandated reporters, but they cannot offer the official report. So it would never go into the case management tool, which is the Defense Sexual Assault Incident Database. We call it DSED. It would just be kind of one of those things. And that goes back to even if somebody comes to our office, I can have somebody sit with me for 3 hours, disclosing and talking and hearing about their options. And if we get to the end of that intake session and they say, I don't want to sign that paper, then no notifications are made. I will provide them some resources, and I will remind them that I am there when they change their mind, if they change their mind, and that they can come back and do this 30 times if they want, but that I'll be there for them until they're ready to make the next step. When we do a restricted report, the adjutant general and the wing commander, if it's on the air side of the house, they get a general notification. And it is very basic. There's no PII, there's no rank, there's no unit attached. So they can't even figure out like, oh, well, this was in this unit or that unit. And it basically looks like, sir or ma'am, one of our eligible members came forward and did a restricted report. It happened on a military facility or off a military facility, and it happened in the last 30 days or more than 30 days ago. Have a good day. And our commander, the wing commander and the tag, have to accept that. They don't like it because they really want to know, they want to take care of their people, but they also understand that this restricted option is important for their people to heal. It gives them situational awareness. And what they also know is that part of my responsibility as a credentialed professional is that if I know that the reported offender has assaulted other people, I actually have to go to our attorneys and say, hey, hypothetically speaking, if this were to happen and I were to know about, multiple offenses, what would my responsibility be? And they would ask me a bunch of attorney questions. And from there, They would tell me that I am legally obligated to keep it restricted, or that I'm legally obligated for safety reasons to unrestrict it. If that were the case that I had to unrestrict it, my first phone call or calls would be to each of the victims affected by that reported offender to make sure that they are, we talk about, remember when we talked about exceptions? This is one of those exceptions, and we are going to have to unrestrict this case, but let's get you connected with your attorney. Let's get you connected with your support services to make sure you understand what you're obligated to do. Because even though we have to unrestrict it, they're still not obligated to participate in the investigation, right? It's going to cause some discomfort because it's a choice that maybe they didn't want, but for safety reasons, we have to. So when I make this notification, where I was going with that is that even though our commanders may not like that I'm not giving them specific information, they also know that if there's a larger threat to the community, and I'm aware of that, I have an obligation to report that. So they do know that. With a restricted report, there is no investigation initiated. Commanders are not allowed to investigate sexual assault regardless, but because it's restricted and command doesn't know who the victim is, et cetera, they can't call law enforcement. There's nothing to call law enforcement and say. And then a line of duty, if eligible for guard members, would be initiated at their request. So that's a restricted report. An unrestricted report, they get all the same support services. That doesn't change, but a victim can tell anybody that they want a restricted report and then come to the SAPR office and file that. The notification is only those with an official need to know. So the wing commander and TAG would again get that no PII notification. Hey, ma'am, hey, sir, there's been an unrestricted report reported. They will get a little extra information. So they, some of the extra information that we give them is, were drugs and alcohol involved? Was there a weapon involved? Those sorts of things, but they still won't have a unit or a soldier or airman name. The unit commander will get the victim's name. And so let's say somebody from the maintenance squadron reported, I would call that maintenance squadron commander and say, sir, ma'am, your airman Sergeant Snoopy has reported an unrestricted report. Here are your next actions that you're required to do, et cetera, et cetera. Again, a line of duty would be initiated. And then the unrestricted cases are discussed in a very limited case management group monthly. When we do an unrestricted report, or when we have an unrestricted report, only those with an official need to know are notified. So a supervisor may not even know that somebody has reported an assault. If the victim is doing well at work and they're not missing work and they don't need exceptions or leniency in their schedule or whatever, there's no need for that supervisor to know. And so that's part of the conversation that I will have with the commander when I notify them to say, hey, ma'am, hey, sir, let's talk about who has an official need to know. Let's talk about who's in this person's reporting chain and whether they need to know. If the first sergeant, if there's nothing going on with morale and welfare, the first sergeant maybe doesn't even need to know. And that's going to look different for every case, but we do have that conversation with the commander so that they know that. And I say investigation is potentially going to be initiated because, we're working with local law enforcement when we report these, and we have had times where it has not gone past. Whether they decided there wasn't enough to investigate, or it made it through local law enforcement up to the DA's office, and the DA's, for their legal reasons, said we can't go any further with this. So that's why I put investigation potentially initiated, because we can't guarantee what local law enforcement is going to do with the information once we get it to them. 99.9% of the time, they are responsive and assistive, and they help, and they're there to ask the questions. And I can thankfully, honestly say that to this point, I'm going to knock on my wooden desk here, any of the local law enforcement that we have worked with have been very supportive of our victims coming forward. And in my opinion, have done the best and the most that they are able to do. But these cases are just they're not always easy. They're never easy, and some are just harder than others. So let's talk about some benefits and limitations to each report type. Again, with the IRC change, I keep talking about catch, but we haven't talked about it. I think that's coming up in the next slide or two. So we'll talk about that. But with a restricted report, some benefits: access to medical, advocacy, legal, and counseling services. So legal, let me explain that real quick. We have a program that is called the Special Victims Council. And what that is a military attorney for the victim. Now, that's not because the victim did anything wrong. That is in the event that a military process is going to happen, that SVC, that Special Victims Council, is legal advocacy for the victim as they go through the military process, right? So for example, let's say that we're going through a separation board, right? And I say we being the command, not SAPR office, but the command. So let's say the command decides that, in this case, this scenario, it is a military offender. Command is going to separate that soldier who committed the assault. That soldier or airman will have the opportunity to request a board and not accept that notice of separation. So they can request a board. The board works similarly to a trial, but it's an administrative process. It's not a criminal process. This is for National Guard. Keep in mind, National Guard, and each case is going to be different. So this is just for this scenario. And so we're going through this board with the victim and the reported offender. If it's a military member, that SVC is that legal advocate to say, oh, wait a minute, no, you forgot to bring this up, or, hey, we're not okay with that plea agreement, because they can do similar to like in the criminal court, like plea agreement type situations. I'm not the attorney, so I'm probably using the wrong language, but I think you get where I'm going. So having that advocate, that legal advocate for them is fantastic. They both, restricted and unrestricted, have access to that. They both have access to a forensic exam, and we will absolutely get them there, support them through that, get them through that process. That would be for National Guard, that would be taken care of out in the community with our local hospitals and so forth. A benefit of the restricted report is that it does remain confidential. And for some people, that's important. That can be a limitation, though, if that victim needs maybe some leniency in their guard schedule, their drill schedule, or so forth. They can participate in catch. Now, the catch program was originally started for restricted reports. We'll talk about it more in depth later. But one of the IRC changes is that unrestricted reporters can also participate in catch. Benefit to a restricted report is that you can change it to unrestricted at any time, but that would be a limitation for an unrestricted report, is that you can't change it to restricted. Once that cat is let out of the bag, that kitty cat runs around like crazy and there's no putting it back in the bag. Some benefits to unrestricted, if you look over to the green side of the screen, is the potential for the law enforcement investigation, and then ultimately, hopefully, holding that offender accountable. Command support, which you can't have with a restricted, right? Because if the commanders don't know, they can't support. Protective orders, military and civilian, as well as the expedited transfer. So those are some benefits for the unrestricted report. Recent legislation gave our commanders comparable legal, Kara can tell you the right legal terms, but basically, prior to this most recent legislation, if a commander gave a military protective order, that was only in effect when the reported offender military member was in a status, right? So 2 days a month if they were only a drill status type airman or soldier. So Monday through Friday, when they weren't even on the base, that protective order didn't matter. It's a little different than active duty, because when you're active duty 24/7. So on the civilian side, the law enforcement would issue a cease harassment. And what this new law did was it gave our commanders the same legal power as an officer would have, a law enforcement officer, for that cease harassment. So for our folks now, they can, a commander can issue that cease or the military protective order, comparable to that cease harassment. And if that's violated, then they could go for the full protective order. So great things happening. Like, it takes time, and we see where we have gaps and issues, and we work to get some changes, and sometimes those will help. So looking forward to see what that actually does in how much our community partners are even going to recognize that and see that. So we go into the limitations. Reported offenders will not be held accountable if it's a restricted report, right? Because we're not notifying law enforcement. So that's something that victim survivor has to weigh, and take into consideration. They are not eligible for an expedited transfer that requires command approval. And with a restricted report, command is not aware. And protective orders, same thing. That's a commander has to do that. So we say that they can't receive a protective order, military or civilian. Technically, any one of our members can go out and request a protective order. But once they have notified law enforcement of an assault, then that crosses that bridge to the unrestricted side. So it can be a little catchy, because also, if the reported offender is military, they have a duty to report when they have interaction with law enforcement. So if they're issued a protective order, they are required to report it. So again, that notification to command about a law enforcement action as a result of a sexual assault. And so that can change things. So those are the things that we weigh with the members when we have to, and let them make their decisions. And then of course you can see some of our limitations and for the unrestricted. So services and opportunities available, non-clinical advocacy. So the SAPR team, we are non-clinical. If I feel that one of our members is at high risk, one of our reporters, one of our victim survivors, I am required to reach out to somebody who is trained and credentialed appropriately to do a clinical safety assessment. And then if necessary, we institute a high-risk response team. We do not do counseling. We are non-clinical advocacy. And a lot of folks kind of miss that in the big picture, but it's really important to remember that this advocacy service through this program is non-clinical. If there is a clinical need, we refer out. Special Victims Council, we talked about that earlier. Medical services, military treatment facility only if they're in a Title X status or have some sort of a status that allows them to be there. Local hospitals and clinics, mental health treatment and counseling, both on the civilian side and in the military side. Chaplains assistants, catch, we're going to talk about that in the next slide. And let's see, on the unrestricted, command support. Command support really is the big one that goes away when one of our folks chooses a restricted report. Okay, so CATCH, a serial offender program. We are really getting close to the end here, and I know I'm pressing it for time. So let's go with CATCH program. So Congress said to the Department of Defense, fantastic that you give your folks a restricted option. We love that you're letting them get healthy, but there's still a serial offender issue and we need to get a hold of that, figure it out. So the NDAA 2015 mandated that the Department of Defense figure out a way to get a hold of serial offenders, like somehow still support those who want a restricted report, but cover down on this serial offender issue. So they made the Department of the Navy the gatekeepers of this program, but it's all DoD. It includes restricted reports and some unrestricted reports. So initially it was only for restricted reports, but this past year with the IRC recommendations, they opened it up to those who file a restricted report, or I'm sorry, an unrestricted report, but do not make the reported offender's name known to law enforcement. So that could be because they're not ready for the investigation, but they need command support or want command support. It could also be because they don't know the reported offender. They want command support. They wanted an unrestricted report, but they don't know who that person was, right? It's voluntary at all stages, and I'm going to explain kind of what that looks like in a few minutes. And it's a law enforcement tool. So with the exception of explaining this to the victim survivor on our initial meeting, and generating passwords for them to get into the system, the SAPR professionals cannot participate any further than that. So if they have trouble with inputting information, or if they're questioning what kind of information they should put in, we need to refer them, we, the SAPR team, need to refer them to their Special Victims Council, because this being a law enforcement tool, if we're seen as filling a law enforcement role, our confidentiality could go out the window. And we don't want to do that to our victim survivors. And so we will generate that password after explaining it to them if they choose to participate. And then, as a matter of fact, they can't even sit in our office while they fill this out. They can fill it out on their home computer, on their smartphone, their tablet, whatever they have. They just can't do it in the presence of the SAPR professional because it's a law enforcement tool. I think that says enough. So the CATCH program, how does it work? So the example that I have used since 2019, when this program came into effect, actually makes a lot of sense now with this change. So you'll see what I mean when I explain it to you. So let's say that somebody comes to me and they file a restricted or an unrestricted report, and the only thing that they know about their reported offender is that it was a female with short brown hair and she smelled like cigarette smoke and she had a tattoo on her right forearm. With this program, the victim can go in to this secure database and input any information that they know about their reported offender. Yeah, really cool. So if they know the reported offender's name, their address, what they drive for a car, their height, their weight, their color hair, where they work, where they frequent, I mean, any information they know, any tattoos, any of that they can put in, but as much or as little as they choose to put in. Now, what happens at above the detective level, above the investigative level, the analysts will analyze all of this data. If they have what they see as a match, so none of the victim's information goes into the system, it's specific to a case number. So when I generate that password, it is specific to a case number for that victim survivor. So let's say we have 3 matches in the system, right? So 3 people have put into the system that their offender was a female with short brown hair and she smelled like cigarette smoke and she had a snake tattoo. 3 people. What will happen is the analysts, after having made what looks like this match, will contact me. Let's say all 3 cases were my cases, but I don't always know who the offender is, right? So maybe I didn't know, oh, there's 3 of the same person, right? So they will contact me and they will say, hey, Ms. Rogers, it looks like your case numbers 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, 11, 12. Looks like there might be a match. Can you go talk to your client and let them know? I'm not going to be able to tell them who the other matches were because that's a confidentiality issue, right? But I will be able to go to them and say, hey, you know, the folks at CATCH, they let me know that it looks like there might be a match to your reported offender. What would you like to do? And then they get to make a choice. They have multiple choices. They can choose to go forward with an investigation. They can choose to not go forward with an investigation, but leave their information in the system. And just a little look, squirrel, it just started snowing outside my window. Lovely. I love it. Anyway, so participate in the investigation, not go forward with the investigation, but leave their information in the system, or not go forward with the investigation and remove their information from the system. So let's say in this scenario, two of the 3, I just realized you probably can't see this because of the backdrop, but 2 of the 3 decide they want to go forward. When the analysts send down the information to the investigators, they can only and will only send the information from those 2 cases. The investigators will never know that there was a 3rd victim. The only way that's going to happen is if by chance they uncover that over the course of the investigation. And that could very well happen. So really great tool. When this first launched back in 2019, I remember having briefing the domestic violence task force, you know, up here in Penobscot County. We're all in each other's task force, right? The folks from rape response services are at the Partners for Peace meetings, and the Partners for Peace folks are at the START meetings. And so we're all intermixed. So I had this whole group of folks who do this great work, and I got to say, look what we're doing. It took a bit before matches started happening, but we do get monthly updates on what's happening. Matches are being made, people are coming forward. Court martials have happened, not here in Maine, active duty. I'm not speaking to Maine solely, it's, you know, the DOD as a whole. But matches are being made and court martials are happening and people are being held accountable because of this tool. And so back to the community meeting when I was briefing this, I remember Candace Sable. So if any of you ever worked with her, you know, she's an amazing human, and she just kind of had jaw dropped. She's like, I really wish we had this for our, you know, the civilian side of the house. And the reality is this is a DoD program, but if the reported offender is a civilian, guess what? And that match is made and those folks decide to go forward with the investigation, this could affect the civilian community as well. So while it's not a civilian tool, there are ways that it can and will probably help the civilian community. And just remember, whether we're active duty or guard, we live in the community. We are part of the community. So in one form or another, it is going to help the community as well. One of the things that has been consistent with the statistics that they give us on the CATCH program, and I'm really proud of this, but I think it speaks to a bigger picture, and I'm not 100% sure what that picture is. When we look at this, so the system, because of my role in the database, it will track how many times I generate a password specific to the case. So that being said, if a victim puts in their information and then say a month later they remember something, they can come back and ask for a new password. That password that they get is good for one-time use or up to 10 days, and then it expires. But they can come back for as many passwords as they need. And I just, give me a moment, I just lost my train of thought. I was going, oh, what I was proud of. So the system tracks how many passwords are generated attached to each case, but it also tracks whether the password was used to be logged into. And the National Guard as a whole has the highest percentage of people who request the password and then actually input data. And I think that says a lot. You know, it says that they're willing to put themselves out there, and you know, how big or small of a way is individual perception, but they're willing to not just ask for that password, but go in and put that information that they have, whether it's a lot of information or a little, they're willing to go in and do that in the hopes that they will catch a serial offender. And I think that says a lot for our citizen soldiers and citizen airmen, for sure. So I know that that's going to trigger a whole lot of questions. So write them down. We'll do a Q&A. But let's talk real quick and wrap this up a little bit and talk about some of the services that are available, not just locally, but some of our DoD services. So in the Maine National Guard, as I said at the beginning, I am the newly hired Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Officer. I will be managing both the Army and the Air National Guard SAPR programs. Right now, we have a full-time victim advocate coordinator on the Army Guard side of the house. That's Eric Carter, and my contact information and his is there. I put some asterisks after the phone number for me. This is my current government cell phone as I sat at the Air National Guard side of the house. When I have fully transitioned to this new role as the SAPR officer, I will actually be taking over a different number, and I will make sure that Kara has that. It's not up here on this slide. I apologize. That being said, we also, so the job announcement is currently out for my replacement at the Air National Guard side of the house, as well as we are getting a full-time victim advocate at the Air National Guard side of the house. And hopefully that job announcement will be coming out in the next month or two as well. And so super important that we get that out there. So if you know anybody, you know, we can't make guarantees, but be looking on USA Jobs for those positions to post. We want to have great people. So those are contact information for us. The 24-hour sexual assault response line for the Air National Guard is 307-5466. And then the Wing Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, of course, right here is the same number that I'm answering right now. We are actually working on creating a 1-800 number that will be both Army and Air. For right now, because we have limited staff, it's going to be myself or Mr. Carter that answers that hotline phone. So just call it and we're going to answer it. It's a 24/7 coverage. But we will be instituting, hopefully in the next couple of months, a 1-800 number that will cover down both Army and Air. We also have, on the Air side of the house, we have a Director of Psychological Health, Ms. Tracy Souza. And on the Army Guard, same role, but we call that the Behavioral Health Officer, and that's Ms. Naya Clifford. Naya has a small team of folks that work with her. Right now, Tracy is by herself, but if you call any one of us, we can get you to any of the new hires as we're onboarding new folks. We also have Army and Air Guard chaplains, and you can see those numbers. Some other things that we have available to our folks are the vet centers. Anybody who has experienced military sexual trauma can be seen at the vet centers. That is different from the VA. They are part of the VA, but they operate under different rules in terms of who they can see and who they can't. And then, of course, TOGIS, the VA Center, extension 7490 for military sexual trauma. And that would be Mary Rose Killane managing that program as we speak. And hopefully that doesn't change for a while because she's super awesome. And then as far as DOD, we have the DOD Safe Helpline. We also have www.sapper.mil. That is the DOD Sapper website. And we have Military One Source that is a wide array of resources for airmen and soldiers. What I will say is that if you're working with somebody as the Attorney General's office, it's clearly going to be an unrestricted report, but it is good to know that Military One Source does not have confidentiality. So if you know somebody outside of an actual case who's tied to the military, it's important to know that do not use Military One Source if they want a restricted report, because Military One Source is a mandated reporter. I want to jump back up to the Safe Helpline because I really dig the Safe Helpline. And I dig it for the reasons that it's multifaceted. It is a website. It is a 1877 number. You can text the DoD Safe Helpline, and they also have an app, the DoD Safe Helpline app. Any of these platforms, you can get access to the closest SAPR professional. So let's say one of our folks was visiting Michigan, and God forbid something happened in Michigan, and they didn't have my number with them. They can actually call or get on the app and put in Maine National Guard, and my contact information will come up. Or if they just want the closest SARC, they can put in that they are in Alpena, Michigan, and that closest SARC will come up. There's some self-help stuff on there, like adult, electronic coloring and stuff like that, but really great stuff. They also have Safe Help Rooms, which is anonymous chat that is run by RAIN. So for those of you who have used the RAIN platform or are aware of the RAIN platform for the anonymous chat rooms, it's the same platform. It's just through the DoD Safe Helpline. And then some really great stuff happening there for that. So I can't talk about those things enough. These are not the only resources that are available for our folks. These are just the primary ones. Okay, so a couple more things to get through, and then we'll close it down for the day. Those snowflakes are getting bigger out there, so ooh, I have to drive to Augusta after this. So okay, what are we teaching our currently serving members? Congress mandates that they have annual training. So we do annual training that is specific to the SAPR program itself, what their options are, what the new programs are, any changes and updates. A portion of that is prevention training. We had a 5-year contract on the Air Force side of the house with Altruistic, and so we did a Green Dot program. Each branch dictates their own training. And so it will look a little different for the Army side of the house, but they will put something similar into place. We also have a part of the IRC is that we have a newly hired prevention workforce. And so they will be doing a lot of data analysis to figure out where we really need to focus our prevention work, because if we're spending too much time on continuum of harm when we really need to be taking it further or even earlier than that, that's some stuff that we'll be coming up with. So big changes with that as well in the next couple of years as they work through that data and make their recommendations. So retaliation recognition and prevention is part of that training, right? So what we want to do is inform and empower and resource commanders so that they can act on reports of retaliation, but more importantly, address it before it even happens so that folks understand this is unacceptable and it will not be tolerated, and we will address this, as we go. But more so for folks to understand, right? We can say the word retaliation all we want, but who can actually sit down and define it? Who can, if we went to this average soldier or the average airman and say, tell me what retaliation looks like to you, can they actually do that? So empowering our commanders and informing them so that they can teach their folks, what does retaliation look like, right? Not part of my program, but one of the DoD efforts has been for years is human labor and sex trafficking. We have members of the United States military who have been trafficked. We have folks who have tried to join the military who have been trafficked, but weren't able to join for various reasons. Maybe it had to do with mental health, wellness, and those sorts of things. Maybe it had to do with arrests. We all know how that works, not okay. But it's sometimes one of those things. But it has happened within our military ranks at all levels, right? I shared with you Sergeant First Class McQueen and what he was doing with his victims that were reporting, and that female chief on the USS O'Kane having that prostitution trafficking ring on the ship. It does happen. And so we do teach and talk about that. We talk a lot about culture change and what does that look like? Active bystander intervention, commanders' talking points so that they can have those conversations with their folks. There is specialized training that comes down for our first responders. So security forces folks, our military cops, medical personnel have separate training other than the mandatory SAPR, this is the program training. They have training that they have to go through as first responders. Even the chaplains, because they are considered first responders, they have training that they have to go through. And the annual refresher training, that's what I talked about earlier. And that is for all military and civilian employees. So it's not just if you work for the Department of Defense, you are required this annual training. Contractors and state workers, they are not mandated that because they work for different organizations technically, but they are highly encouraged to go. And so we let our commanders know, like, it's important that they know who and what they're working with, right? So we highly encourage you to send your contractors and your state workers there, but they're not required because this is a DoD program. So DoD employees, military and civilian employees. We have training that we do pre-deployment and post-deployment. Pre-deployment really happens when the deployed member gets to their deployment location. So they get a briefing or a training with that SAPR team that's on the ground there. Reminders and, hey, this is where we're at and who wants to be a part of the program and help and support. And then we call the return and reunion brief. When they return from a deployment, we also do about a 30-minute talk through with them just to remind them what their options are. It may not be that they were victimized, but maybe they know somebody else who was. So just a reminder, this is how you can help your friends. And then out processing to basic military training for Army and Air, as well as their AIT, or we call it tech school in the Air Force side of the house. They get repetitive training as we go. And that is not just the programmatic training, but also prevention training, bystander intervention training. Okay, so some of our current challenges that we are working through, and really not a lot you can do with this, is just something for you to be aware of. Getting memorandums of agreement to happen, right? The military, the DoD cannot dictate what a local hospital or a local sexual assault response center does, right? But we can work with each other and say, hey, we understand you work this way. Can you do this with us and for us? And we in return can or cannot do this for you, and to better support our people, right? And part of that is this education, right? Part of that is you being willing to sit and listen to our program and giving me the opportunity to share that with you so that you understand when you are working with our folks. Geographical challenges. Number one, Maine is huge. We are a driving state. We are not highly populated for the amount of land that we are. And we have a lot of folks who are rural, and you know what that looks like, getting support out to our rural, even in the, civilian members. So advocacy and accessibility can be a challenge just by way of us being large, but also not all of our members live in the state of Maine, right? So if we have a member who reports an assault, but they live in New York, having the resources in the state of New York to be able to help those people and hunting down what those could be and those sorts of things. So geographically, it can be a challenge. When we're in the active duty arena, most people live within an hour of the base, right? Because they work there every day and they have to drive there every day. But in the Guard, we live all over, right? You're just coming to Bangor or Augusta 2 days a month. You stay over in the Armory, or you stay in the Horizon Inn for those couple of nights, and then off you go back to your life for the other 28 days. And so geographic challenges are huge. Culture change, right? You've heard it, we see this in all cultures. This is not just military, but that crusty old thought process still exists. We're working on it and we are getting better. But that comes with education and that comes with time. With that, well, that's the way we've always done it. I can't think of a grouping of words that makes me cringe more than, well, that's how we've always done it. But we're working through that. And I think that's something that just as humans, we can address, and we are. The military can have a bad rap, right? We're a public organization, right? Where our paycheck is paid by the taxpayers. And with that, everything that we do is a public thing. Whether we're talking active duty or Maine National Guard, it's a public thing. And so oftentimes the military in general can have a bad reputation. And so that's something that we have to get through. So I'll share real quickly, probably about 12 years ago, I was flying, I still lived in Hawaii, and I was flying from Oahu to Maui to go do some training. And I was in my blue uniform, my dress uniform. And I sat next to this older lady on the plane, super nice. And she thanked me for my service. And I typically will respond with, it's an honor to be able to serve, because not everybody is able to that wants to. But anyway, so she, once we got settled in, she said, I have to ask you, dear. And she's, patting my arm like my grandmother would. She said, I have to ask you, aren't you afraid of being sexually assaulted? I think she actually used the word rape, but basically she said, aren't you afraid of this, being a woman in the military? And that really hurt me, because most women in the military are not sexually assaulted. Most men in the military are not sexually assaulted, but it does happen. But that's how she saw that. When she saw me, a woman in a uniform, she went there because of the reputation that these things can create for us. Another challenge that we have is too much sapper talk, right? Like, people get tired of hearing about it. So finding new ways to get that message out and get that buy-in and that education on the continuum of harm without it being too much. And so that's something that we're consistently working through. I have a few things crossed out. This is our very last slide, I promise. What can you do as the victim advocate to help our service members if they request assistance? So this slide is built kind of for you folks working with Ms. Kara, but also for our community partners who, like at Rape Response Services or SARSM and SASM, who work with our folks. So I have a few things crossed out here, because by the time our folks work with you, they're not going to have, they're going to be past the point of a forensic exam or some of these other things, or even catch, because if they're working with you, it's already unrestricted and we're there, we're there. But it's never a bad thing to ask that victim that you're working with, if you know that they're National Guard or military, if they'd like a SARC to work with them. Maybe up to that point they haven't been working with us, but maybe now they're ready. So just a reminder that we do exist, and would you like them to come, to support you. Reminding them that it doesn't obligate them to support services. I have on here, it doesn't obligate them to a report, but obviously for you folks, if they're working with you, they've already made that report, but it also doesn't obligate them to take our support services. I can sit down, like I said before, and have a long conversation with people, but if they choose not to participate, that's okay. Let's see, the fact that they will not receive a bill for a forensic exam, the ability to help them with victim witness assistance in any way, whether that's compensation or, those sorts of things. Just the reminder that that's available and that we can assist as a whole, the team. The one thing that I want to really point out to you folks, and I'm sure I have no reason to believe that you don't do it. I just feel like it's a responsibility that I have to kind of bring up, is for our folks who really do understand the SAPR program and how our advocacy program works. What they always hear from us is confidentiality, confidentiality. We have confidentiality, right? I'm not allowed to say, if a commander asks me, hey, can you remind me what that victim's name is? I actually can't tell that commander what the victim's name is. I have to tell that commander, you can go get that from the provost marshal, but I can't tell you. Like, it cannot come from my mouth. That's how tight our confidentiality is. And so our soldiers and airmen, they hear that from us in training, like that we have confidentiality. Come talk to us. It stays in the room unless you choose for it to leave the room. Whereas when they're in this part of the process and they're working with victim witness assistance, there's a different requirement on that confidentiality. And so just if you could just make sure that they understand the difference between your flavor of victim advocacy versus our flavor, so that they understand that you are part of the whole team, but your responsibility is a little different. I think that would be my big ask. I know from talking to Kara in the past, that is part of what you folks talk to them about, but recognizing just how important that is for our military folks who consistently get this talk about victim advocates have confidentiality. So making sure that they understand that. I have given you a ton of information today, and I am getting ready to move on to my next commitment for the morning. So again, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I have questions up here, but clearly you will not be asking me questions today. Please write them down. You can send them through Kara, and I can either draft an email response to you, or like I said before, we can do a live Q&A one of these days on the information that's in this presentation. With that, have a great day, everybody, and take care.